In the autumn of 1943, a formation of American B-17s pressed eastward over Germany at 24,000 feet, engines droning in disciplined unison. From that height, the world below appeared distant and abstract, a grey geography interrupted only by cloud and contrail. The formation held tight spacing, each aircraft bound to the others by doctrine and necessity. Survival depended on cohesion. Then the sky erupted. Flak bursts appeared without warning, black, concussive blooms detonating with mechanical regularity. They were not aimed so much as calculated, placed where bombers were expected to be. Shrapnel tore outward in violent arcs, striking aluminum skin and internal structure with indiscriminate force. The formation flew through it because there was no alternative. One bomber took more than its share. A burst caught it squarely, followed by another, then another. Panels buckled. Systems flickered. The aircraft began to lose the precise rhythm that kept it aligned with the others. Its nose dipped slightly, then corrected, then dipped again. The formation moved on, compelled forward by momentum and orders that allowed no pause. Smoke soon streamed from the damaged aircraft, thin at first, then thickening into a persistent trail that marked it unmistakably. Debris fell away in fragments, metal, insulation, pieces of a machine never meant to shed itself in flight. The bomber's position slipped backward, its outline growing more isolated against the vastness of the sky. The escorts were already gone. Fighters that had guarded the formation earlier had peeled away to engage threats elsewhere or had exhausted their fuel. At this altitude and this distance, the bomber stood alone. There would be no cover, no intervention from above. The formation could not slow without endangering itself. Separation, once begun, became final. German interceptors noticed immediately. They did not rush. They adjusted course with practiced ease, angling toward the trailing aircraft as if responding to a signal. Isolated bombers were not surprises, they were opportunities. The geometry of the air war shifted subtly but decisively. Inside the damaged aircraft, the crew felt the change before they fully understood it. The sound of flak faded, replaced by the awareness of exposure. The formation ahead receded, unreachable now. What had been collective effort narrowed into individual endurance. The fight did not begin with gunfire. It began with distance opening where unity had been. With one aircraft falling out of rhythm. With the quiet realization that the rules had changed and that whatever followed would be faced alone. The damage could no longer be concealed by distance or formation. As the B-17 drifted alone through open sky, its wounds announced themselves plainly. Control surfaces responded with hesitation, lagging behind input, then overcorrecting. The aircraft no longer felt solid. It felt improvised, held together by momentum and habit rather than design. Inside, reports moved compartment to compartment with clipped urgency. Wounded crewmen were accounted for, then reaccounted for as conditions changed. Intercom voices carried strain without panic, each man performing his role because that was what training demanded. There was no central moment of realization, only a steady narrowing of options. The defensive guns still spoke. Turrets tracked the sky, and bursts of .50 caliber fire cut outward in disciplined arcs. But coordination faltered as systems failed and sight lines shifted. What had once been overlapping fields of fire became isolated gestures of resistance, effective in isolation but fragile as a whole. Outside, German fighters circled with deliberate restraint. They did not press the attack immediately. There was no need. Time favored them. They adjusted position, tested angles, gauged response. The bomber's condition was evident to anyone who knew how to read an aircraft in distress. This was not a fortress anymore. It was a problem already in decline. Within minutes, survival odds collapsed. Not through a single catastrophic failure, but through accumulation, hydraulic pressure bleeding away, control authority degrading, crew effectiveness diminished by injury and shock. Each passing second reduced the aircraft's ability to dictate its own future. The crew understood this without discussion. They did not dramatize it. They continued working checklists, manning stations, returning fire when targets appeared. Discipline held, even as belief thinned. Hope, if it existed, was procedural rather than emotional. From the perspective of the interceptors, the situation had resolved itself. An isolated bomber, damaged and unsupported, followed a familiar trajectory. There were no surprises left to account for, no variables that favored survival. The aircraft was marked not by designation or paint, but by inevitability. As the fighters tightened their orbit, the logic of the air war asserted itself. This was how it ended for bombers that fell behind. The question was no longer whether the B-17 would be destroyed, but how long it would take and how much resistance it would offer before that conclusion arrived. American bomber doctrine left little room for illusion. Crews were taught plainly that an isolated aircraft over Germany did not return. Formation was protection, separation was exposure. Training films, briefings, and casualty lists reinforced the lesson until it required no repetition. Once alone, the outcome was not debated. It was anticipated. From the beginning, crews were conditioned to fight until there was nothing left to fight with. Defensive fire continued until guns were disabled or ammunition exhausted. If the aircraft remained controllable, it stayed in the air. If it did not, bailout followed, provided altitude allowed it. At 24,000 feet, under pursuit, capture was considered unlikely. The descent from that height rarely left time for orderly survival. Inside the damaged bomber, this understanding required no discussion. There was no dramatic exchange, no spoken acknowledgement of what lay ahead. Each man absorbed the situation privately and returned to his station. Habit replaced fear. Training filled the space where speculation might have taken hold. The aircraft itself began to feel smaller. Compartments once separated by function now felt compressed by circumstance. Noise intruded from everywhere, air rushing through torn metal, engines laboring unevenly, distant impacts reverberating through the frame. The world beyond the fuselage narrowed to what could be seen through small windows and gun sights. Men focused on tasks because tasks were finite. Instruments were checked. Guns were manned. Reports were passed along without emphasis. Each action was an assertion of order against a situation that offered none. They did not expect these actions to change the outcome. They performed them because not performing them would mean surrendering too soon. Expectation hardened quietly into acceptance. Not resignation, but clarity. The crew did not imagine rescue or reversal. They imagined sequence, attack, damage, descent. The details were uncertain, but the arc was familiar. Others had followed it before them. The air war was full of such trajectories. This acceptance carried a strange calm. Fear remained, but it was contained, bounded by procedure. There was no benefit in panic. Panic wasted time, and time was all that remained. Each man understood that how he acted in the next minutes would define what little control he still possessed. As German fighters continued to circle, the crew's belief settled into place. This was how it was supposed to end. Not dramatically, not heroically, simply as a consequence of separation. The bomber moved forward through thinning air, its future already written in doctrine. What none of them yet understood was that belief, once fixed, could still be challenged. And that far below, between altitude and impact, the fight would refuse to follow the ending they had been taught to expect. German interceptor doctrine approached the air war with uncompromising clarity. Bombers were not opponents to be outmaneuvered, they were threats to be eliminated decisively. Training emphasized rapid destruction, breaking formations, shattering airframes, and ensuring that damaged aircraft did not escape to fight another day. Efficiency, not engagement, defined success. Isolated bombers were treated as priorities. Once a B-17 fell behind its formation, it ceased to be part of a system and became an opportunity. Doctrine encouraged immediate focus on such aircraft, not out of cruelty, but calculation. A lone bomber required fewer resources, exposed fewer risks, and offered a high probability of confirmation. It was the cleanest form of interception. To that end, German fighters were equipped accordingly. Heavy cannon fire was designed not merely to disable, but to fragment, tearing wings, rupturing fuselages, igniting fuel. The goal was structural failure, not prolonged exchange. The bomber was to be broken quickly before defensive fire or chance could intervene. Numerical advantage reinforced this confidence. Interceptors rarely approached alone. Coordinated attacks allowed pilots to strike from multiple angles, overwhelming defensive guns through timing and mass. Against such concentration, even the flying fortress's reputation thinned. Doctrine assumed that resistance, however determined, would be temporary. Within this framework, bomber crews were viewed impersonally. They were components of a larger industrial process, extensions of factories and supply chains. Individual survival did not factor into tactical assessment. The aircraft mattered. The payload mattered. The men aboard were incidental to the calculation. Mercy held no place in this system. It offered no advantage and introduced uncertainty. Hesitation endangered pilots and compromised results. Doctrine rewarded decisiveness and punished deviation. The air war allowed little room for interpretation and none for exception. From this perspective, the damaged B-17's fate was already settled. It had separated. It had been identified. It would be engaged until destroyed. The process was familiar, repeated countless times across German skies. There was nothing remarkable about it, only another application of rules that had proven effective. As interceptors tightened their approach, belief hardened into assumption. The bomber's resistance, whatever form it took, would end the same way others had. The system did not account for persistence beyond reason, nor for individuals who refused to disengage when logic demanded collapse. The doctrine was confident because it had been validated repeatedly. And as the German fighters prepared to finish what flak had begun, there was no indication, on paper or in practice, that this encounter would unfold any differently. The B-17 had been built around a promise. Its designers believed that durability could compensate for exposure, that a bomber strong enough could endure the sky long enough to complete its mission. Armor plate protected vital positions. Systems were duplicated, then duplicated again. Control cables ran redundant paths. Overlapping fields of .50 caliber fire were meant to turn open air into defended space. On paper, it was not merely an aircraft. It was a concept. Crews were trained to believe in that concept. From the first days of instruction, faith in the machine was cultivated deliberately. Stories circulated of fortresses returning with wings shredded, tails half gone, engines shot out and still running. The aircraft's reputation became psychological armor, reinforcing the idea that survival was engineered as much as earned. Confidence in the B-17 was not naive, it was institutional. But that confidence carried assumptions. The fortress was designed to fight as part of a formation, each aircraft supporting the others, defensive fire interlocking into a collective shield. The doctrine did not imagine isolation as a primary condition. Strength was distributed. Protection was mutual. The machine's promise depended on proximity. Alone, the equation changed. Redundancy could delay failure, but not prevent it indefinitely. Armor could absorb only so much force before structural integrity began to erode. Overlapping fire depended on coordination, and coordination depended on systems that were already failing. What had been resilience in formation became exposure in isolation. Under concentrated attack, design met reality. Cannon fire struck with intent, not randomness. Hits accumulated where redundancy could not compensate, control surfaces, spars, hydraulic lines. The fortress resisted, but resistance was no longer abstract. It was measured in minutes, then seconds. Each new impact tested not only metal, but belief. Inside the aircraft, that belief began to thin. Not collapse, but adjust. Crews did not abandon faith in the machine, they recalibrated it. The B-17 was still flying. It was still fighting. But it was no longer invulnerable. The promise had limits, and those limits were becoming visible. This realization did not produce panic. It produced clarity. The aircraft could survive punishment, but not without cost, and not without support. Design alone could not substitute for circumstance. The fortress had been engineered to endure, not to defy inevitability. As German fighters closed in, the reputation that had carried the B-17 across continents confronted its harshest test. The machine would do what it could. The rest would depend on the men inside it, on how long they could continue to function once belief in invincibility gave way to something narrower, more fragile. The promise of the flying fortress had not been false, but it was incomplete. And as the first sustained attacks began to tear deeper into the airframe, the difference between survival by design and survival by will began to matter more than anyone had anticipated. The first concentrated attack arrived without ceremony. German cannon fire tore into the fuselage with deliberate precision, shells striking where flak had already weakened structure. Metal ruptured along stress lines never meant to open. The sound inside the aircraft changed immediately, no longer the steady violence of turbulence and engines, but the sharper, hollow crack of failure. Structural integrity began to give way in stages. A control surface stopped responding altogether. A section of the fuselage sagged, then twisted slightly under load. Bulkheads designed to distribute force absorbed more than they were built to endure. What had been damaged became deformation, then loss. Entire sections of the aircraft were effectively destroyed while still attached. Cables snapped. Hydraulic pressure vanished. Compartments that moments earlier had been occupied became exposed to open air, oxygen streaming away into the sky. The bomber was no longer a unified machine. It was an assembly of parts losing coherence. Altitude bled off without command. The nose dropped, then fell further as the aircraft passed the threshold where lift could no longer compensate. Engines still produced power, but propulsion no longer mattered. The bomber did not descend so much as surrender height. Instruments lagged behind reality, confirming loss only after it had already occurred. Bailout options disappeared almost as quickly as they were considered. Doors jammed, sections collapsed inward. Parachutes were unreachable or unusable at the angles now imposed by gravity. At this speed and altitude, escape required conditions that no longer existed. The sky outside offered no refuge. The aircraft crossed an invisible boundary between flight and fall. Control inputs no longer shaped direction. Airspeed increased beyond design limits as gravity replaced aerodynamics. What remained of the bomber's structure was now being tested by forces it was never meant to experience. Inside, the crew adjusted without panic. Reports shortened. Movements became economical. Each man understood that survival no longer depended on regaining control, but on enduring what followed. Time compressed. The sequence ahead could not be altered, only survived. From the perspective of the attackers, the break appeared decisive. This was the point where bombers usually came apart, shedding wings, breaking into sections that fell separately toward the earth. The pattern was familiar. The outcome appeared settled. But as the B-17 dropped through the sky, still largely intact despite everything taken from it, the fight refused to conclude. The aircraft was no longer flying, yet it had not become inert. And in that narrow interval, between structural failure and total destruction, seconds began to matter more than altitude. Survival now depended not on doctrine or design, but on what could still be done in the time remaining. Amid the collapse, one gunner remained conscious. Where structure had once enclosed his position, open sky now intruded without warning. The aircraft no longer shielded him from the wind or the cold. Air tore through the compartment, stripping heat and sound alike. At 24,000 feet, oxygen was already thinning. Now it fled completely, pulled away by speed and damage. His oxygen system faltered, then failed. Breath became shallow, deliberate. Vision narrowed at the edges. Pain registered only as information, another signal among many demanding attention. There was no moment to assess it fully. Training filled the gap where reflection might have taken hold. Hands moved because they had been taught to move. Procedures surfaced not as memory, but as reflex. The gun remained operational. That fact alone anchored him. As the aircraft fell, German fighters closed again, assuming collapse would finish what cannon fire had begun. They approached cautiously at first, then with renewed confidence, expecting no meaningful resistance from a bomber already in descent. The gunner fired anyway. Short, controlled bursts cut through the rushing air, tracers streaking past as the aircraft tumbled. He did not aim for victory. He aimed for space, forcing distance, complicating approach, making every attack require reconsideration. Each burst imposed cost on an enemy expecting none. The structural collapse continued around him. Metal groaned and flexed under loads it was never meant to bear. The aircraft vibrated violently, buffeted by forces beyond design limits. Still, the gunner held position. His world had narrowed to a firing arc, a rhythm of breath and trigger, the discipline of repetition. German pilots began to hesitate. This was not how falling bombers behaved. They expected debris, not resistance. Fire from a descending aircraft disrupted timing and formation, forcing attackers to break off and reapproach from less favorable angles. The descent, meant to be terminal, became contested. Each moment of hesitation mattered. It stretched the engagement, forcing German fighters to expend fuel and attention on a target that refused to become inert. The gunner's persistence altered the geometry of the fight. What should have been a conclusion became an interval. Oxygen deprivation pressed harder now. Movement slowed. Consciousness required effort. Yet the act of firing provided structure, an anchor against disorientation. He did not evaluate risk or probability. Those calculations belonged to another phase of the war. This phase allowed only continuation. Resistance persisted where doctrine said it should not. The bomber was falling, breaking, disintegrating by degrees, and still it fought back. The gunner's presence defied expectation not through innovation of equipment, but through refusal to disengage. Below, altitude unwound rapidly. Above, German fighters reassessed a situation that no longer matched assumption. Between them, in the open air of a collapsing aircraft, one man remained at his post. And as long as he did, the descent was no longer just a fall. It was still a fight. The B-17 entered a steep, uncontrolled descent that no pilot would have chosen and no manual described. Its nose dropped sharply, then yawed as damaged surfaces fought against the air unevenly. The aircraft no longer responded to coordinated inputs because there were none left to give. It was falling through altitude bands that had once defined safety and danger, crossing them too quickly to mark. Airspeed climbed past design limits. Wind hammered exposed structure with relentless force, peeling away what flak and cannon had loosened. Panels tore free. Internal frames twisted under load. The sound inside the aircraft became a continuous roar, a pressure that erased subtlety and replaced it with raw motion. Gravity had taken command. Propulsion no longer mattered. Engines that still turned contributed little more than noise. Lift had been replaced entirely by descent, and descent by acceleration. The bomber's identity as an aircraft was dissolving. It was becoming a mass in motion, driven downward by physics alone. And still, the gunner tracked targets. His perspective shifted violently as the aircraft tumbled, horizons sliding unpredictably across his field of view. He compensated not through calculation, but through feel, anticipating motion rather than correcting it. Training adapted itself to conditions it had never anticipated. Each burst of fire brought moments of space. Not safety, not advantage. Space. German fighters approaching a falling aircraft expected chaos, not coherence. The gunfire forced them to brake, to reposition, to reassess angles that no longer behaved as expected. In the language of air combat, even seconds mattered. The aircraft continued to disintegrate as it fell. Sections separated under stress. What remained flexed and shuddered with every change in airflow. The B-17 no longer resembled the bomber that had crossed the coast hours earlier. It was an object in the process of becoming something else, held together by forces no one fully understood. Control, such as it was, became instinctive. There was no time for conscious thought, no capacity for fear as a separate emotion. Action followed necessity directly. Fire, pause, adjust, breathe, fire again. The rhythm anchored awareness against the vertigo of acceleration and loss. German pilots began to treat the descent itself as a threat. A falling bomber that continued to fire disrupted expectation more effectively than one flying predictably. The engagement lost its familiar shape. Pursuit paths overlapped. Attacks aborted mid-run. The certainty that gravity would finish the job no longer held. Altitude unwound relentlessly. The sky grew denser, darker, louder. Forces shifted as air thickened and speed fluctuated. The aircraft was breaking apart, yet it refused to become passive. In that contradiction lay its remaining strength. The descent should have ended the fight. Instead, it transformed it. The B-17 was no longer climbing, cruising, or maneuvering, but as long as it fell with intent, it remained engaged. And somewhere between gravity and impact, control survived not as command, but as persistence. From the outset of the descent, German pilots assumed the outcome was inevitable. Bombers that fell this way did not survive long. Structural failure usually followed within seconds, wings tearing free, fuselages splitting, debris scattering across the sky. Gravity, combined with damage, was expected to complete the task efficiently. As the B-17 continued downward intact, the first attacks resumed cautiously. Fighters approached in measured arcs, expecting the aircraft to disintegrate before they reached firing position. Instead, gunfire met them, accurate, sustained, and deliberate. The assumption that resistance had ended proved premature. The gunner continued firing without pause. His rhythm did not change with altitude or acceleration. Each burst forced attackers to break off, reposition, and try again. What should have been a final engagement stretched into a sequence of aborted runs and misjudged angles. The falling aircraft remained lethal. Its motion, unpredictable and violent, complicated approach paths. German pilots found themselves chasing a target that refused to behave as physics suggested it should. The descent created uncertainty where none was expected. Formations began to loosen. Timing eroded as pilots adjusted individually rather than collectively. The engagement lost its symmetry. Where doctrine relied on coordinated attack, hesitation introduced gaps. The bomber, despite its condition, imposed disorder on those meant to finish it. Assumptions collapsed mid-descent. The belief that gravity alone would resolve the encounter no longer held. German pilots had to account for continued resistance, for a machine and crew unwilling to become passive. That recalculation altered behavior. Attacks slowed, fuel burned, risk increased. The character of the fight changed. What had begun as interception became endurance. The question shifted from how quickly the bomber would break apart to how long it could continue to impose cost. The engagement was no longer governed by altitude or advantage alone, but by persistence. This shift did not favor the bomber in conventional terms. It remained damaged, descending, and outnumbered. But it disrupted certainty. In air combat, certainty often determines outcome more than firepower. Once shaken, it is difficult to restore. As the aircraft fell through lower altitudes, the sky around it thinned of attackers. Not because the threat had vanished, but because the logic of engagement had fractured. The bomber had become something unexpected, a falling target that demanded respect. In that moment, the descent achieved what altitude and formation could not. It altered the enemy's calculus. The fight had not ended when it should have. It had changed direction, and in the space created by that change, survival, once unthinkable, entered the realm of possibility. As the bomber fell, it passed through altitude bands that usually separated phases of the air war. At 20,000 feet, then 15,000, then lower still, the character of the sky changed. Air thickened. Control surfaces, though damaged, responded differently. The descent slowed from sheer acceleration into something more irregular, as drag began to assert itself against gravity. German pilots adjusted reluctantly. Some broke off to conserve fuel, unwilling to chase a target that refused to end. Others returned for brief attack runs, testing whether the bomber had finally exhausted its resistance. The pattern was no longer continuous pursuit, but intermittent contact, engagement starting and stopping without resolution. The gunners' persistence shaped this rhythm. Each time fighters approached, they were met with fire. Not reckless volleys, but disciplined bursts that forced attackers to react. German pilots began spacing their runs farther apart, altering angles, hesitating where certainty once guided them. The bomber dictated tempo not through maneuver, but through refusal to disengage. The fight stretched beyond expectation. Interceptions were meant to be brief, decisive, concluded at altitude. This engagement ignored that structure. Minutes passed where seconds were predicted. Fuel gauges edged downward. Pilots weighed risk against diminishing return. The bomber, though falling, continued to impose cost. Crucially, the aircraft refused to become inert. It did not transition into wreckage or debris. It remained a fighting object, demanding attention and caution. That persistence challenged the assumptions underpinning interceptor doctrine. Gravity was no longer sufficient. Completion required commitment, and commitment now carried consequence. In this altered environment, survival became possible, not because the bomber had regained advantage, but because the engagement had lost coherence. The German pilots were no longer executing a clean intercept. They were managing an anomaly. Anomalies consume time, attention, and fuel. The sky itself seemed to misbehave. Patterns that governed altitude combat blurred. Expectations tied to height and speed no longer applied cleanly. The bomber's descent carved a moving pocket of uncertainty through layers of air that normally imposed order. As the aircraft continued downward, the intensity of pursuit thinned. Not out of mercy, but recalculation. The cost-benefit equation had shifted. What remained was no longer a guaranteed kill, but a problem with diminishing clarity. In that slowing of the air war, where engagement stretched, broke and reformed, space opened where none had existed. The bomber was still damaged, still descending, still in danger. But for the first time since separation, its fate was no longer sealed. The sky had ceased to behave as planned, and in that disruption, survival, once impossible, found room to take hold. The bomber slipped beyond the primary interception zone without announcement. There was no clear line marking the transition, only the gradual absence of pressure, the thinning of attackers, the widening of space between the falling aircraft and those that had pursued it. What had been a contested sky loosened its grip. German fighters peeled away in stages. Fuel had been burned, chasing an outcome that refused to arrive. Ammunition had been spent without confirmation. Patience, as much as resources, had worn thin. One by one, aircraft broke off, climbing away or turning back toward bases that demanded results elsewhere. The pursuit did not end in triumph. It simply ended. The B-17 continued its descent, now angled toward territory where the air war thinned and coordination returned. Engines still struggled. Control remained minimal. But the aircraft was no longer being actively hunted. For the first time since separation, the crew was not reacting to immediate threat. The gunner tracked the sky out of habit, then realized there were no targets left to track. The firing arc remained empty. No shapes closed. No tracers answered. His finger eased off the trigger, not from exhaustion, but from confirmation. The fight, improbably, was over. Silence followed in uneven waves. The roar of air remained. Structural noise persisted, metal flexing, loose components rattling under stress. But the distinct rhythm of combat was gone. No cannon fire, no engines closing fast. The absence itself felt unfamiliar, almost disorienting. The aircraft remained barely intact. Sections that should not have survived still clung together. Control inputs produced delayed, imperfect response, but response nonetheless. The bomber was no longer falling freely. It was descending with intention, however limited that intention had become. Inside, roles shifted quietly. Weapons were secured. Injuries were reassessed. Attention moved from defense to endurance. There was no celebration, no relief expressed aloud. Survival did not arrive as emotion. It arrived as task, maintaining what little control remained, preparing for whatever landing awaited below. The air war had receded upward and outward, leaving the bomber alone again, but not in the same way as before. This isolation was no longer a prelude to destruction. It was a corridor of possibility, narrow and uncertain, but real. Combat had been replaced by consequence. Every decision now concerned survival rather than resistance. The crew adjusted accordingly, grounding themselves in procedure, focusing on what could still be done rather than what had been lost. As the aircraft descended through quieter air, the meaning of what had occurred began to settle, not as triumph, but as reprieve earned under conditions that offered none. The B-17 had not escaped by doctrine or design, it had endured by persistence. The sky had released its hold. What remained was the ground, and the question of whether the bomber, barely held together by will and motion, could reach it intact. The ground arrived without warning, not as a destination, but as an unavoidable fact. What remained of the bomber struck under conditions no checklist had prepared for, too fast, too damaged, too incomplete to be called a landing. The impact tore through what was left of the airframe, folding metal inward and outward at the same time. The aircraft ceased to exist as an aircraft in that moment, becoming wreckage scattered across unfamiliar terrain. Survivors were pulled from the remains by hands that moved with urgency and disbelief. Some emerged conscious, others silent, all marked by shock. The smell of fuel and burned metal hung in the air. Parachutes lay unused. Sections of the bomber that should have separated miles earlier were still attached, defying every expectation of structural failure. Medics struggled to understand what they were seeing. Injuries matched violence far greater than the wreckage suggested should have been survivable. They examined twisted spars, shredded control surfaces, and missing sections of fuselage, trying to reconcile the condition of the aircraft with the fact that men had lived through it. The damage profile did not align with survival. Reports filed afterward reflected the same confusion. Descriptions bordered on disbelief. Airframe compromised beyond limits, control lost at altitude, sustained engagement during descent. Engineers and officers read them carefully, then reread them, looking for error. None presented itself. The numbers were wrong only because the outcome was. Witnesses fixated on the descent. Ground crews and civilians alike spoke less about the impact than about what they had seen overhead. The falling aircraft that did not break apart, the flashes of gunfire where none should have existed, the duration of a fight that should have ended minutes earlier. The image resisted simplification. At the center of those accounts stood the gunner. His actions, relayed second-hand and reconstructed through testimony, defied explanation within established frameworks. No doctrine accounted for sustained resistance from a disintegrating aircraft in freefall. No manual described the conditions under which he had continued to function. Yet the evidence was undeniable. The story did not spread loudly. It circulated quietly, passed between crews, mentioned in briefings without emphasis, shared cautiously among those who understood the air war well enough to know how improbable it was. It was not celebrated. It was absorbed. Survival, in this case, did not invite triumph. It invited questions. How much punishment could a machine endure? How long could a man continue once every assumption had failed? The answers were uncomfortable, because they suggested that limits were not as fixed as doctrine claimed. The bomber had not reached the ground intact, but it had reached it together, and that distinction mattered. It reframed the descent not as collapse, but as endurance carried beyond reason. What had begun at 24,000 feet as a certainty of destruction ended on the ground as an anomaly no one could easily categorize. The wreckage remained, undeniable and mute. The men lived. And between those facts, a story took shape, not as legend, but as something more troubling. A reminder that in war, outcomes are not always decided where doctrine says they should be, and that sometimes survival is not granted by design, but earned minute by minute, all the way down. In the days that followed, analysts attempted to reconstruct what had happened using the only language the war trusted: diagrams, measurements, probabilities. The aircraft's damage profile was laid out piece by piece: missing sections, ruptured spars, control systems severed or degraded beyond tolerance. On paper, the sequence was clear. Structural failure should have occurred far earlier in the descent, at altitudes where forces exceed design margins decisively. Engineers traced stress paths and calculated loads. They identified moments where the airframe should have separated completely, where wings should have folded or the fuselage should have torn apart under acceleration. According to every model available, the bomber should not have remained coherent long enough to reach lower altitudes, let alone sustain engagement during descent. And yet it had. The discrepancy could not be ignored. Something had altered the engagement dynamics in ways that engineering alone could not account for. The falling aircraft had continued to impose cost, forcing attackers to adjust behavior rather than execute cleanly. That persistence reshaped the timeline, extending the fight into a space doctrine never considered. German reports, reviewed alongside American accounts, noted the same anomaly from the opposite side. Pilots described unexpected resistance from a bomber already assumed lost. Attack runs were aborted, formations disrupted. The descent, rather than simplifying the engagement, complicated it. No report framed the encounter as defeat, but none described it as routine. Doctrine offered no explanation. Interceptor theory assumed that gravity resolved damage efficiently, that falling aircraft transitioned quickly from threat to debris. Bomber doctrine assumed that once control was lost, resistance ended. Neither framework accounted for sustained action under freefall conditions. What emerged instead was a recognition of scale. Small actions, continued firing, delayed disengagement, momentary hesitation, had cumulative effect. Seconds accumulated, distance opened, fuel burned. Each decision, insignificant in isolation, reshaped the outcome when stacked against expectation. Survival entered the record not as triumph, but as data. An outlier, a case study without conclusion. It did not invalidate doctrine, but it exposed its limits. The models still held, but not absolutely. They required amendment, footnotes, caveats that acknowledged the role of human persistence. The war preferred clean explanations. This encounter resisted them. It suggested that machines fail according to rules, but people do not always follow them. That refusal, intentional or instinctive, can bend timelines without breaking them. In the end, the bomber's survival was recorded not as a miracle, but as an anomaly that could not be replicated deliberately. That distinction mattered. It kept the story grounded, uncomfortable, resistant to myth. But once entered into the record, the implication lingered. Survival had become a data point, evidence that outcomes are not always decided where calculations say they should be. And in that quiet margin between expectation and result, the war revealed something it rarely acknowledged: that persistence, even when stripped of advantage, can still rewrite the ending. Why he kept firing is a question that resists simple answers, because the conditions themselves defy normal explanation. At extreme altitude, amid structural collapse and oxygen loss, duty no longer resembles the clean abstractions taught in classrooms. It becomes narrower, more elemental. Duty is no longer about mission success or strategic value. It is about doing the next required action when everything else has failed. Training provided the anchor. Long before the aircraft broke apart, repetition had carved behavior deeper than conscious thought. Muscle memory replaced deliberation. Procedures, practiced thousands of times under controlled conditions, surfaced automatically when control vanished. In that sense, training was not merely preparation for combat, it was preparation for disorientation, a way to function when clarity disappeared. Fear did not vanish, but it was compartmentalized. There was no room for it to expand. Each task absorbed attention completely, leaving fear without space to dominate. Fire, pause, adjust, breathe when possible, fire again. Repetition imposed structure on chaos, allowing action to continue even as circumstances deteriorated beyond reason. Courage, in this context, did not resemble boldness. It was not expressed through aggressive maneuver or dramatic gesture. It took the form of refusal to disengage simply because conditions dictated collapse. Refusal to accept that loss of control required surrender of agency. He did not believe he could win. He believed he could continue. The machine failed first. Systems broke down in predictable ways. Structure yielded under forces it was never designed to endure. Engineering limits were reached and exceeded. None of this was surprising. Machines are built to tolerances, and once crossed, they behave consistently. What followed those failures was less predictable. The human element did not collapse alongside the airframe. Stripped of protection, deprived of oxygen, subjected to acceleration and cold, the gunner continued to function. Not indefinitely, not effortlessly, but long enough to matter. That persistence altered the engagement not through superiority, but through presence. Meaning emerged not from outcome, but from continuity. Each moment of resistance extended the timeline, disrupted expectation, and forced recalculation by the enemy. None of this was planned. It was not innovative in a technical sense. It was simply the accumulation of small acts performed when larger ones were impossible. In war, machines are often credited with endurance. Armor thickness is measured. Redundancy is engineered. Survivability is quantified. Yet machines endure only within design limits. When those limits are exceeded, what remains is human decision. Whether to persist when systems say stop, whether to continue when outcome is no longer favorable. This persistence does not guarantee survival. Most who reached such conditions did not live through them. That reality tempers any attempt to romanticize what occurred. The gunner did not uncover a universal truth about courage. He demonstrated a specific one, that refusal to disengage can still shape events, even when it cannot change odds. The war often treats individuals as functions of equipment and doctrine. This encounter reversed that relationship. Equipment became incidental. Doctrine became irrelevant. What mattered was that a person remained present in a moment designed to erase presence entirely. In that sense, the answer to why he kept firing is not heroic or philosophical. He kept firing because that was the last meaningful action available to him. When altitude, control, and certainty were stripped away, persistence became purpose. The human element reasserted itself not by overcoming physics, but by enduring alongside it. Machines failed as expected. Gravity behaved predictably. What did not behave as predicted was the refusal to stop. And in that refusal, the war revealed something it rarely acknowledges. That even at the limits of destruction, human persistence can still alter the shape of events, not by winning, but by continuing. With distance comes clarity, but also restraint. Decades later, the event resists embellishment not because it lacks drama, but because it needs none. Records remain sparse, reports are technical, testimony is fragmented. Yet within those gaps lies the measure of how narrowly the moment escaped erasure. A few seconds less endurance, a single earlier failure, and nothing would have remained to examine. The bomber is remembered not for the mission it failed to complete, but for the way it refused to vanish. It did not return in formation. It did not fly home intact. Its legacy is bound to a vertical line through the sky, a descent measured not in miles, but in choices made under collapse. What history preserves is not its power, but its persistence. Aircraft are usually remembered in level flight, engines synchronized, purpose clear. This one is recalled for falling, for losing altitude without losing consequence, for remaining present in the fight long after doctrine said presence was impossible. In that sense, the bomber's final minutes tell a truer story of war than its hours en route to the target. The gunner is remembered not for maneuver or marksmanship, but for staying. He did not save the aircraft. He did not reverse the engagement. He did not defeat his attackers. What he did was simpler and more difficult. He remained at his post when remaining no longer served a clear outcome. In a war obsessed with objectives, that distinction matters. War is often described in terms of scale, tonnage dropped, aircraft lost, missions flown. But its decisive moments are frequently measured in seconds. Seconds in which a decision is made to continue rather than disengage. Seconds in which a body follows training instead of fear. Seconds that accumulate quietly until the outcome shifts just enough to matter. Survival in this case was not granted by design. The machine did not perform beyond its limits because it was meant to. It performed beyond them because it was forced to, held together by motion and human insistence. Survival arrived not as a reward, but as a consequence of refusal. Refusal to accept the moment when stopping seemed most reasonable. That distinction separates endurance from luck. Luck may open a door, but endurance decides whether anyone walks through it. The bomber's descent was not a miracle. It was a prolonged negotiation with gravity, enemy fire, and structural failure, one that continued only because someone kept acting while everything else unraveled. With time, the temptation is to frame such moments as symbols, to elevate them into lessons or legends. But the truth is quieter. The gunner did not act to be remembered. The crew did not endure to make a point. They did what remained possible because stopping offered nothing better. In that way, the event avoids myth. It does not suggest that persistence always prevails, or that courage guarantees survival. Most who reached similar conditions did not live. What it shows instead is narrower and more honest, that persistence can still shape outcomes, even when it cannot change odds. The bomber did not return as it left. It did not fulfill its role as intended, but it carried its crew to the ground together, and that outcome, unlikely, undocumented by doctrine, resistant to explanation, was enough. History remembers many aircraft for what they destroyed. This one is remembered for what it endured. And it remembers one man not for how long he fought, but for when he refused to stop. At 24,000 feet, they destroyed his aircraft. He fought all the way down.